Hello and welcome to the video. In this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the tips and tricks I use to set up bind and fly quadcopters. Looked at loads of these kind of quadcopters recently. We've looked at things like the Betaflight 210, we've looked at things like the awesome Q100, we've had things like the Copis 1, and they range in size from little small indoor quadcopters right the way up to some very expensive beautiful machines. But a lot of them these days will come with a receiver, and the idea is you set up a model on your radio, bind to it, and off you go. And I'm very conscious that in a lot of the review videos that I'm currently doing, I'm not showing all of the steps. And I know there's a couple of people in my family and a couple of my friends will be getting bind and fly quadcopters for Christmas. So there's two reasons for making this video. One, if you have watched that review video and maybe got one of those quadcopters and are desperately trying to follow along with my summarized view of the setup that I found in Betaflight, then if you watch this, hopefully it'll explain it in a little bit more detail. And secondly, it's going to save me taking 5 or 6 phone calls in between Christmas and New Year from all those friends and family who get a bind and fly quad, who fancy me going round for a cup of tea and a mince pie, and while I'm there, could you set my quad up, buddy? So without any further ado, let's get stuck in here. Now the first thing we need to think about is setting up the model on the radio. Now I have lots of playlists already on the channel that talk about model setup, and really what you want is you want a basic model on your radio. You don't need anything particularly fancy. You want the main 4 controls first, so throttle, aileron, elevator, rudder, or aileron, elevator, throttle, rudder, whichever order your radio does it. You can change that in Betaflight and we'll look at that in a second. And I'd recommend that you then add 2 or 3 additional channels. Now if you're using something like a Spectrum or one of those radios, it tends to assign those auxiliary channels by default to switches, so you don't have to do anything. If you're using something like a Taranis or OpenTX or one of the FlySky radios, then you're probably going to have to add them. I'd recommend you add 1 channel that has a 3-position switch that will allow you to select the different flight modes, another switch that's going to be arming and disarming the quad, and the way modern quads work, as soon as you arm, the props are going to be turning, so you want to have that somewhere where you are going to get to it quickly. And the last one, I tend to put the momentary switch. If there is a momentary switch on the radio, I set that up as a 3rd auxiliary channel, and that way if the model has a buzzer installed, I can have that momentary switch to sound the buzzer, and if it accidentally comes down in a bush or long grass and I'm struggling to find my quad, I can just flick that switch and it will beep at me and help me find it. Next thing to do is bind the radio to the receiver. Now a couple of things here. If you plug the model into your computer using the USB cable and the lights on the receiver come on, I find that brilliant, because that means then you don't have to plug main battery in or any of that shenanigans. You can just power it from the USB port on your computer and press the bind button and follow the instructions in the manual for your quadcopter or the manual for your radio. Now most of the time that involves you putting the radio in a specific mode, putting the radio in a bind mode, and then pressing the little bind button on the receiver as you apply the power, or in this case as you plug the USB cable in. If however you plug the USB cable in and none of the lights come on the little receiver that's on the quadcopter, then you're probably going to have to apply main power. I would always recommend, if you have a little multimeter around, just double check that there isn't any problems on the quadcopter. You don't want to plug it in the first time and a puff of smoke come out of it. I tend to just put the 2 probes on each of the pins on the XT60 connector at the back of the quadcopter, put the multimeter onto the ohm setting or resistance, and what you're looking for is any value that isn't super duper low or 0. As you can see in this picture, we've got like a weird wacky value, and that's fine. You'll find that as the capacitors and all that kind of goodness in the power system kind of charge up, initially it might be very low, but then it will climb. If it does that, then it's absolutely fine, but you'll find that you'll have to plug the power in order to power the receiver to get the radio to bind. Okay, now we're at that point, we can plug it into the computer and have a look at what we've got to deal with. So I'm going to plug this model that I've got here into the PC, and we're going to use the Betaflight application. Now, until recently, the way you got hold of the Betaflight application was pretty straightforward. You just went into the Google Chrome browser, you went to the App Store, you searched for Betaflight, and there it was. However, it is no longer there. Google has changed the whole App Store thing. In fact, they've killed everything. So now if you search for CleanFlight, Betaflight, iNavFlight, and all the configurators that used to be in the Google Chrome store, they are not there anymore. But don't panic, we can still get hold of them. You have to go and download the configurator and run them on your computer as a discrete application. And that isn't as difficult as it sounds. All you need to do is you need to go on to Betaflight, the Betaflight configurator page. I'll put a link in the description. And again, this is a little bit different from all the other videos so far. And that's part of the reason why I'm making this video, is because this process is a little bit different, which is why if you're new to setting these things up, it might catch you out. All you need to do is download the application for the operating system that you're using. So there's stuff there for Linux, for Mac and for Windows. So download, if you're in the Windows, a zip file, double click on that zip file and copy the contents onto your desktop folder or wherever you're going to run the Betaflight configurator from. And then if you open that directory up, you'll find a betaconfigurator.exe. You double click on that and then it will run. So just be aware of that. That has changed very recently and could catch an awful lot of people out. So let's plug this quadcopter in. I can see my radio is plugged in. I don't know if you heard that, but she just warned me there was inactivity alarm. Again, as a safety tip, before you plug anything into your flight controller, particularly if it's on your desk, make sure that your props are not installed yet for safety. So there we are. She is powered up. Now we're going to click on connect. And the first thing I usually do is jump into the CLI and type in version. Now, most of the bind and fly quadcopters that are coming these days are actually running Betaflight. Some of the very small ones aren't. They're running bespoke bits of software. But most of them, pretty much 99 out of 100 that I've looked at recently, have actually been running Betaflight. If you connect to it and you only have 3 tabs here on the left and you go into the CLI command and type version and it doesn't say Betaflight, it might be CleanFlight, it might be iNav or one of those. Just download and connect to it using that other version of CleanFlight, iNavFlight or whatever, and then when you connect to it you'll get all these tabs. Now you can flash your quadcopter with different versions of firmware, but I'm not going to talk about that today. I would recommend before you do anything with your quadcopter, make sure it's flying and working. If you get too carried away and change too much stuff and then find it doesn't work, then whoever you bought it from is probably not going to be very happy about sending it back or returning your money. But we know here that we're on Betaflight. At the moment it's a little bit out of date. April the 3rd 2017. I'm recording this at the very end of November. So I would say I could update this, and I might in the future, but you know what, that's going to be fine. So let's type exit and the quad will reboot and reconnect. So now we've done that, a little tab up here in Betaflight allows you to switch between expert and unexpert mode, or basic mode I guess. There's a lot of extra things in here. I'm just going to keep it on kind of basic mode for now. I'm not going to turn on expert mode. Now the next thing I would reckon you do is in the setup tab, I would rock the quadcopter backwards and forwards, rise the nose, make sure that the camera's at the front, and you want the model on the screen to be moving in exactly the same way. If it isn't, then stop, because it probably means that there is something going on with the board setup or the way it's been installed on the quadcopter. You're also looking at this point for it to be very still. You don't want it flicking and moving around like that, and I'm just doing that on my hands, don't worry, it's not the quadcopter being unhappy. We had a quadcopter where I reviewed it recently and it was doing that and it had a bad board, but you can see here this is pretty rock steady, just sat here waiting to fly. Now we're happy with that, we can very quickly check the configuration. I tend to always check the ports tab just to refresh my memory. I tend to screenshot as I go through with the very new quad each of the tabs. If you press Alt print screen on your keyboard, then you'll find that it will actually save just the window that you're looking at rather than the whole desktop. And if then I've done something where it stops working, I can go back and use that reference. You can use the dump commands or the difference commands in CLI, and that will actually tell you what's been changed. But I just like to have a good look when I'm starting to do the setup, just to see how everything's set up. You're really looking for something to be enabled for serial receiver. Most of the bind and fly quadcopters these days are using S-Bus, and it needs to have one port selected for that S-Bus receiver, and that's all that little tab means. So if you don't see any of these selected as serial receiver, then you might just double check your manual. Big one is configuration. Loads of information in here. This is the layout that the board is using. You've got all these different versions, but Quad X is the standard one. We have lots of different ways that you can talk to your ESC using multi-shot, one-shot or D-shot. If you're using one-shot, PWM or multi-shot, then you are probably going to have to calibrate your ESCs. Most of the modern bind and fly quads these days are starting to use D-shot more and more. If it's set to D-shot, you'll notice that this is a very simple little setup. If it's set to something like multi-shot, you see you get all these minimum throttle and stuff. Those all disappear if you select D-shot. And usually smaller quads, D-shot 300 and 150 is very widely supported. Then you've got D-shot 600 and 1200, which are the super duper fast versions. If the model's been built to a price point, you might see 300 or 150 in there. Both of those will still be super duper. The board and center alignment, this is where if you found that when you move the nose of the model up, it isn't the nose moving in the little graphic, this is where you could potentially change those on how the gyro alignment is all set up. But personally, if you find that that's the case, I'd get back onto the seller because there's potentially other things going on. It should be all set up out the box. This is where the receiver's set up. So here we've got a serial based receiver, S-bus. Pretty much all of the models that I'm getting in at the moment kind of have this setup. And then you have the other features here, whether it's got LED strip, black box, or these other settings too. PID tuning is something that's an entire video on its own. I wouldn't worry about that. The receiver is the next one that we're going to spend a bit of time with. Now, down here you have like a virtual little model. As you move the stick around, you can kind of actually see how it's going to perform. Now, the way it should work here is that as you move the throttle up and down, you should see that it moves from above 1000 to about 2000. It should just stop just below, and the middle position for all the controls should be 1500. If you find that you move the throttle and it's another channel that moves, then all it means is the channel map is different. Now, by default, which is that one, you see that my radio setup is completely different. So that means now the quadcopter has been told to flip and roll. If I increase the throttle, it's actually the roll or the aileron control that's moving. So if you find that that's the case and it's the wrong one moving when you move your throttle, I just try each of these in turn until you find the one that moves. And the way it works is as you increase the throttle, the value should go up. As you move the aileron and elevator control, or if you're in mode 2, the stick on the right hand side, to the bottom left hand corner, you should find that both of the values go to their minimum value. And again, if you move the rudder to the left hand side on the radio, the value should go down as well. Now, make sure that the values don't go above 2000 and don't go below 1000. That's usually done via something called endpoints or travel or servo menus on your radio. If you find that these middle values aren't 1500, then go into your sub trims and play with the sub trims until you get them as close as you can. Now, you see mine are flicking around slightly. That's pretty normal, to be honest, on the cheap and cheerful receivers that are in some of these things. So I just get it as close as you possibly can, and then you should be fine. Now, the next thing we need to do then is we need to think about what controls are going to move each of the pieces here. So let me first of all move that mode switch that I set up. So we see that auxiliary 1 is going to be my mode switch. So in the mode menu you can set it up. Now, this looks a little bit complicated, but it's really not. So the main modes that you have are kind of angle and horizon, and I've set it up to use auxiliary 1. So if you remember, we just looked at a receiver. As I move my mode switch, you can see it's auxiliary 1 that's moving. So in modes, I've said you want to be listening to auxiliary 1, and in the low position, set it for angle, middle position for horizon. And the way that works is this little yellow symbol here is showing me the value of that channel. So if I move the switch, you can see it moves up to the middle, and move it to the top, it jumps here to the top position. So all I need to do is, if I want angle to be selected in this low position, I just need to make sure that these two sliders are bracketing the value, so the value lands in these sliders. So the way it works for me is that if auxiliary 1 is in the low position, it selects angle. If it's in the middle position, it's horizon. And in the top position, neither angle or horizon is selected, and that means we're in rate mode. The other thing I tend to do, I don't have air mode turned on all the time. You can. I select air mode, again to be selected via the mode switch, but only when the mode switch is either in the middle or top position. So when I'm flying in either horizon mode, I have horizon and air mode turned on. In the top position, where I'm flying in rate mode, where it's completely me, then I also have air mode turned on. So if there's nothing else turned on at all, you're flying in rate mode. Now, a couple of other things we've done here. We've also selected the arm. Now, on this version of the setup, the model I've got here, that's auxiliary 3 setup. So in modes, I've said the arm, and if there's nothing set up here, that's what it actually looks like. So if you wanted to arm on a switch, which I'd always recommend these days, click Add Range, select auxiliary 3. And I want it so that if the switch is any other position apart from the low position, that's going to work. So now, as I move auxiliary 3 switch, you can see that it's arming. Now it's beeping at me because I haven't got the battery plugged in. And you'll find that if your model has a beeper, it'll beep at you if you turn it on, it can't find the radio. It'll beep at you if it thinks it's crashed. It'll beep at you if there's any kind of error at all. It can be a little bit daunting when you first get a model and it's always beeping at you, but there's usually a very good reason. That leads me on to the last bit. So in mine, I have auxiliary 4 is my momentary switch. So I'm going to set up in modes. I'm going to scroll down here and set the beeper for auxiliary 4, and when the switch goes from the low position to the high position, so i.e. inside this range that I've selected, it's going to sound the beeper. Now, last couple of things to check here. Motors. We can enable the motors and power them from the main battery. To be honest though, the way I would do that is I'd leave the props off and just double check you can plug the battery in. Again, double checking that there aren't any short circuits or anything using a multimeter for the very first time, and then arm your quad. And when you arm your quad, your motors should start spinning. If they don't start spinning immediately, just go into configuration and make sure that you haven't got motor stop turned on. If you're starting out, then sometimes it can be handy to have motor stop turned on. That means that when you arm the quad, it doesn't immediately start to spin the motors, but it means that at 0 throttle the motors stop. Now that is fine if you're learning and you don't want, you're a bit intimidated by the model, but you'll also find that when you start to do flips and rolls and tricks, at 0 throttle you still want the motors to be running because you want to be able to spin them up faster, and it helps with some aerobatic moves. So you've done most of the setup in here. If it has an on-screen display, I again wouldn't worry about that until you've got it flying, and then you've got things like the LED strips. So if you have LEDs on here, you can set them up too. Final things that I would do just to make sure it's all going to work, again before you put on your props, plug in the battery with the radio connected, arm your quadcopter, set the throttle so that everything is running, and then turn your radio off. In theory, the motor should stop. If it doesn't, then double check your failsafe settings. Most of the flyways that I've ever seen have because the failsafe hasn't been set and the quadcopters merrily flew on when there's been a problem with the radio. Last thing to do, double check all of your settings. Just make sure that you're completely happy. Make sure that you've made a note of everything. As I've said, if you really want to, you can use the dump command, which will give you all of the settings, and you can just select that with your mouse, right click and say copy, and you can then paste that into a Word or a Notepad document. Or the other one is diff, and what diff will do is show you all the things that are changed, and that can be a little bit easier for you to remember exactly how everything was set up. But I'd recommend just keeping a note of all this with the screenshots, and then if you ever lose configuration, you can absolutely get back to where you need to be. Last thing to do then, charge the battery, pop the props on. I would recommend that you balance the props. I know a lot of people don't these days, and then find that they have a twitchy quadcopter and talk about things like using soft mounts for the flight controller. If you balance the props, you usually get rid of most of the vibration in my experience. Attach the props following this diagram, so always make sure that the writing on any props is facing up, and when the props are installed to rotate as per this diagram, they're going to be pushing air downwards. And the last thing to do is plug in that charged battery and give it a very quick test hover. I wouldn't go for a mad fly first time. I would just give it a test hover, make sure all the controls are working fine, make sure that the video transmitter's working and all that kind of goodness. And then once you're confident that you're ready to go, top the battery back up and you're ready to fly. So hopefully that helps those of you that have a bind and fly quad and are going to put it together. And hopefully for all of those of you that I've just pointed to this video, that makes a lot more sense. With this video around, I might get a little bit more peace and quiet between Christmas and New Year for all those friends and family who are no doubt going to give me a ring. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video, and particularly for watching right to the very end. We try and release a video on Tuesday and Friday, and sometimes we'll release 1 or 2 extra ones in a week as well. All of the videos on the channel are organised into easy to use playlists, so do have a look in there, because if you're interested in a subject, we organise all the videos on that subject so you can find them easily all together in one place. If you like what we're doing, then please like and subscribe and tell others about the channel so they can come and join as well. We're available in all of the usual social media places, particularly in places like Instagram, Twitter, and we also share all of our 3D designs on Thingiverse.